Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another enlightening episode of The Gold Standard with Alan Mosley. And here's your host, Alan Mosley.
Enlightening now.
Yes, enlightening.
See, you do this every week. This has become a thing, I've noticed.
Yeah, I have to have a shtick. You know, a sidekick's got to have a shtick.
But you didn't have one for like 20 episodes, but now...
It's because I'm getting comfortable in my own chair.
Okay.
Yeah.
You know what? I'll go with that.
Yeah.
That's fine. We'll go with that.
Yeah.
So, guys, if you want to follow us, you can do so on Facebook, which is facebook.com/TGS Alan Mosley. And you can get us on Twitter, which is @Alan M. Mosley. And really, you don't have to do any of that. We do this every week. Mm-hmm. You can just go to our website, which is thegoldstandardpodcast.com.
That's right.
All right?
All right.
So, what episode is this, by the way? Is this 27?
28.
28?
This is number 28.
Okay.
Sure is.
Okay, I'm going to trust you on that because you're the producer and you would know things because I wouldn't know anything.
Well, I try to keep up with it, but you know.
Well, we're going to have a foreign policy episode this week where we're going to talk about the Helsinki summit where everyone was calling President Trump, you know, a treasonous traitor and whatever. That's just the buzzword of this week. And we're going to talk about the humanitarian crisis in Yemen. Ooh. And who better to have on the show to have a foreign policy episode than Scott Horton. Scott Horton, who is the author of Fool's Errand, Time to End the War in Afghanistan, which I actually have the audio book of, so you can hear Scott Horton read the book, which will be, I mean, you can't do better than that.
That's amazing.
He is also, you can be found at scotthorton.org, which is his website. You've got all of his articles and shows to listen to. He is the managing director of the Libertarian Institute, as well as the editorial director of antiwar.com. Hey, Scott, how's it going?
I'm doing real good. Thanks for having me.
Now, is it a recent update that you're the editorial director now for antiwar.com?
I mean, not really. I've been the editor of antiwar.com for many years now.
Okay.
They just changed the title of it, but there's no raise with the promotion, if that's what you mean.
Oh, well, in that case, let's just cancel the whole Liberty movement. I mean, if we can't make a buck, then what's the point? Now, I got to see you in person down in New Orleans. I guess it's been a few weeks now at the Take Human Action Bash, which was the weekend right before the Libertarian Party convention. We had a good time down there on Beale Street, Canal Street, whatever the streets are in the French Quarter of New Orleans.
Good.
So I'm gonna ask you this real quick before we get to the more serious foreign policy stuff. So what was your takeaway from the whole Take Human Action and convention weekend there with the Mises Caucus and the LP? Or did you even stay for the Libertarian Party convention?
No, I did not stay for the LP convention. I was just in and out of town, came to give the speech, and my clutch went out on the way there. So I was supposed to get there the night before, but I ended up just getting there just in time to give my speech, and then I did get to go out that Saturday night and hang out with some people down on Bourbon Street and go and have some fun and what have you. And then I left the next morning. Yeah. So I'm not a member of the Libertarian Party. But I do like the Mises Caucus. I like what they're trying to do. Mm-hmm. I think the Libertarian Party, you know, I gave a speech there, and it's not a speech I've ever given before. You know, I'm used to giving my Afghanistan speech or my terror war speech. I don't really need notes anymore for those. But this was a speech that was sort of about libertarianism and about, you know, kind of the parable of Ron and Rand and how the Libertarian Party really needs to be more Ron than Rand and that kind of thing. But, you know, I really skipped. There were two major parts of the speech that I didn't really get to mention. Mm-hmm. And the first part was I didn't really get into how badly the Libertarian Party had dropped the ball on the terror war this whole time, but most especially and most importantly in the Bush years, when the Libertarian Party should have been right there, you know, arm in arm and neck and neck, for that matter, competing to be the vanguard of the anti-war movement in America with the Answer Coalition of the leftist anti-war protesters at that time. And this is, in economic terms, this is our comparative advantage. And we completely blew it. They completely blew it. And I was even going to tell my anecdote about meeting with Judge Jim Gray at the Libertarian Party convention in Atlanta in 2004, when, you know, he resorted to this talking point that, well, we can't leave now because the violence will get worse. And which was basically just the Fox News talking point that, maybe we shouldn't have invaded Iraq. Maybe they never threatened us. Maybe they didn't have any weapons or ties to Osama. But, geez, we can't leave now because now that we turned their country upside down, we have to stay and make sure that everything is okay. Mm-hmm. And the thing about that, of course, is, as I argued with him then, but boy, especially in hindsight, that just couldn't have been more wrong. In the early summer of 2004, that was before all the worst decisions were made. Yeah. It was that fall that America helped the United Iraqi Alliance write the Constitution. And then the next January was when the supermajority Shiites won the election and the civil war began. Mm-hmm. And 1 million people died. And it was because the U.S. stayed. Right. That was why. Mm-hmm. So Judge Gray was just absolutely wrong parroting that talking point, and the Libertarian Party as a whole was basically taking that same position, when what they should have been doing was calling for Bush and Cheney and Powell and Tenet and Rice and Wolfowitz to be imprisoned for war crimes. That was absolutely what should have happened. Starting an aggressive war is against the law. And the Libertarian Party should have been absolutely out front on that, demanding an end to the war and demanding criminal accountability for the principals committee of Bush's National Security Council, including the president, for starting that war. And they just absolutely dropped the ball. And I was the foreign policy advisor to Michael Badnarik during that time, and he's a good man. But he just could not learn from me how important this was. I would teach him, here's what's going on in the war, and I would try to teach him why this should be the centerpiece of his campaign. And instead, he ran on guns. Well, I promise never to take your guns. Well, he's running against George W. Bush, who just let the assault weapons ban expire, who you couldn't find one red-blooded American gun-owning male anywhere between San Diego and Bangor who was worried that George Bush was coming for their guns. Right. Yeah. He just wasn't. Yeah. And nobody was afraid that he was. And so it was just George Bush, especially in 2004, he was the Iraq War. Mm-hmm. And that absolutely should have been the basis of the campaign against him. And for that matter, of the entire Libertarian Party's, perspective on everything during that time. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, during the Obama years, too, we saw all the liberals and progressives go away. The hardcore leftists stayed good on it. But the liberals and the progressives and the Democrats just shut their mouth. As long as it's Obama doing the genocide, it's just fine. Mm-hmm. And so another place where the Libertarian Party absolutely had the comparative advantage to be the vanguard of the anti-war movement in America, and they just absolutely dropped the ball. So then what's the opposite of that? Finally getting their act together and realizing that now is the time. The Libertarian Party is a synonym for the anti-war movement in America, and we really mean it. And put that out front and put the Libertarian Party out front in the society on trying for real to make this change. Donald Trump, there's a Washington Post story where Donald Trump said, why do we have to have troops in Somalia? And James Mattis, the Secretary of Defense, said, you have no choice. Yeah. Well, that's just not right. James Mattis the Libertarian Party should have come out the next day and demanded that James Mattis be fired and that American troops are pulled out of Somalia immediately. And in fact, what did Trump do? He sent in the infantry, not just special operations forces. But now we have regular infantry on the ground in Somalia, escalating that war, along with the other 7. Yeah. And this is absolutely what the Libertarian Party should be fighting about. And then the other part of the statement I wanted to make there that I left out of that speech was that I think the Mises Caucus does itself a disservice by being, Mises, nobody knows if that means Ludwig von Mises or if that means the Mises Institute. And I love the Mises Institute. I'm friends with everybody at the Mises Institute, from Dice to Thornton and Murphy and Woods, and all these guys are my friends. I'm not saying anything bad about that, but I'm just saying the reputation is the kind of the frame of reference is that these are the paleo libertarians, that these are kind of the right-wing libertarians. And if the Mises Caucus sets itself up to be perceived, no matter, if this is really the deal or not. But if they're perceived as being some kind of right-wing putsch that's trying to take over the Libertarian Party from the paleo-conservative right, then they're marginalizing themselves. They shouldn't be the Mises Caucus. They should be the Libertarian Caucus. And they should be so damn libertarian that every other faction of the Libertarian Party wants them to be the new leadership, agrees with them that the old way of doing things, everybody running as Rand and trying to not be too offensive and trying to be, Republicans, but for pot smoking and whatever kind of thing, which has not worked this whole time, that if they could appeal to the rest of the Libertarian Party instead of saying, we're better than you, at this, that, the other thing, to just say, don't you want us? Don't you think that it's time now for this kind of change? I mean, and honestly, man, I pay very little attention to the internal fights and this and that, but, I know there's a Libertarian Socialist Caucus. Yeah. And so, and then there's been this big fight kind of between these new right-wing libertarians and the leftist libertarians here that call themselves libertarians. And, I would be for stopping them if they really try to amend the Libertarian Party platform to include abolishing bosses or whatever, private property rights or whatever it is that they think. But on the other hand, what if that just wasn't the issue? Because what if the issue was that we're all working together on ending the war in Yemen, on ending the war in Somalia, on ending the war in this and that, and the war on drugs, for real, in a substantive way. Yeah. And really find the common ground on, like always, stopping the government from doing the very worst things that it does first. And then that way, I think the Libertarian Caucus would be much more successful. And, I don't think he's going to run. I'm fairly certain he's not. But, I've tried myself to talk Tom Woods into running for president, for the nomination for the presidency next time. And, he has a reputation, I think, mostly unfairly as being, more conservative or more right wing. He certainly comes from the right. And yet there's such advantage, right, in him running as the libertarian's libertarian, not as a paleo libertarian at all, but as the libertarian's libertarian. And he's just a crowd killer. I don't know if you've ever seen Tom. Well, you saw him at that thing give a speech. But, those are his people. But I've seen Tom. We did a speech together in New Hampshire where he just came in there like, all right, let's talk about liberty. And everybody's just like, yeah. I mean, he can really do it. He really has the talent and the charisma to be a great candidate and to be a leader of the whole party. So my idea is don't fight with Nick Sarwark. Kill him with kindness. Don't fight with these people. Be better leadership than them, that the Libertarian Party, that the rest of the party would want to rally behind. And so, I don't know why anybody listen to me, because I'm not even a member of the party, and I don't know what I'm talking about. But don't I sound like I'm right to you?
Yeah.
No. Well, you know what? We're gonna get to Helsinki and Yemen later in the show, but I didn't want to spend too much time talking about the LP. But now that you've opened the can of words, I do want to say a few things, just because people who watch the show know where I fall on it. So first of all, I'm not a member of the LP. I'm not going to be a member of the LP. I know a lot of our favorite people have joined the LP recently. That doesn't change my mind in any way. Like, good for them. I'm happy that they are. I appreciate what they're trying to do, but I'm not in the LP either. With that said, for one, I do agree with you that it's when a faction that makes up like 0.1% of the population is arguing with a faction that makes up another 0.1% of the population, it's just pointless and not worth it. So I agree with you from a strategy standpoint to not argue with certain unnamed elements and kill them with kindness. I'm with you with that 100%. One thing I will say is, we're sitting here in 2018, so it's been a decade since, Ron Paul, more than a decade since he was up there on stage during the 2008 election cycle, and he was preaching a staunch anti-war message at a time when that was not the most popular thing to do, and he was running as a Republican who was a staunch anti-war message, which I know a lot of people come to the liberty movement or to the Libertarian Party from that. And so one of the things that like for me, is kind of like an unforgivable thing, is elements within the LP that made Ron Paul and Ron Paul people feel unwelcome, when this is a guy who has brought more people to the message of peace and liberty in my lifetime, for sure, for 100%. And so I certainly don't appreciate that, but I agree with you. If there's one thing I agree with you more than anything we've ever discussed, it's something that Tom had actually said in the speech in New Orleans, which is, there's anarchists and there's minarchists, there's left libertarian, right libertarian, and hell, we got audacious caucuses, socialist caucuses, and everything in between. If there's one thing, if there's just one piece of the platform that we all have to be on, or you're not a libertarian, it's you have to be anti-war.
Right, and the problem with Ron, according to the LP people, is that he's a right-wing deviationist, when of course that's really not the case, right? Or it is the case that Ron is conservative on a few issues, and yet that's not what created the Ron Paul revolution. It wasn't that finally we got somebody who's going to stop the Mexicans. That wasn't it, right? He ran on peace. And that was what rallied millions of people. And I mean, to be perfectly clear about this, the idea in American culture is that to be anti-war means you're a Jane Fonda loving traitor. You're a tie-dye pot smoking hippie. Yeah. You're a girl in a sundress singing "Give Peace a Chance," but you don't know anything about anything. And why would anybody listen to you? Meanwhile, the red-blooded, tough guy American male protectors of the society have to do what we have to do, right? And so Ron came out and said, oh, yeah, well, I'm a white, conservative, Christian, completely, culturally conservative, square, Republican congressman from Texas. Yeah. And I make Michael Moore look like Hillary Clinton, which Michael Moore does look a lot like Hillary Clinton. But he basically passed out permission slips to the entire right half of the American political culture that you can be anti-war. If you like your identity, you can keep it. But you don't have to believe in this George Bush, Dick Cheney aggressive foreign policy anymore. And they said, wow, you can do that? Great. Yeah. And by millions and millions and millions of people, they latched onto that thing and onto his campaign, onto the Ron Paul revolution. And then we saw what happened with Rand. Rand tried to water all that down. And then he ran for president. The first thing he didn't come to the Ron Paul revolution. He went to Sheldon Adelson and said, what can I do to please you, Mr. Moneybags? And the Ron Paul revolution abandoned him immediately. They never even joined up, supported him in the first place. And the reason why was because he tried to water it down. And that's really what the LP has tried to do all this time. They go, look, we can't win elections by being, radical anarchists and revolutionaries and this and that. Yeah, well, you can't win being a Republican who's for bro jobs, too, either. You know what I mean? The fact of the matter is that there's already a Republican in every race, and he already has at least a 50% chance of winning. Nobody's going to abandon him for the libertarian candidate over pot and bro jobs. That's not how it's going to happen. Yeah. And in fact, the Libertarian Party is never going to win anything, really. And I mean, my suggestion for them would be to abandon all state level races altogether and run only for Congress and the presidency, Congress, Senate, and the presidency. Forget the governorships, forget the state representative levels and all this kind of thing. The purpose of the Libertarian Party in that Harry Brownian fashion is to provide a platform to teach people about liberty, because regular people don't pay attention to politics unless it's a presidential election year. That's the only time they're paying attention. Well, so what you need is Harry Brown to be a guest on your radio show. What you need is Harry Brown to have a spot on C-SPAN to say, look, this is what libertarianism is about, to convert more people to our movement, and then so our movement is more powerful and more influential. So not so much that we can recruit and convert all of American liberalism and conservatism to libertarianism. The liberals and conservatives, 300 million Americans, they're not all about to become libertarians, but we can accentuate and help the best of the left and the right to prioritize what we say is most important: peace and freedom.
Well, it's interesting that you were talking about Harry Brown there, because you had mentioned earlier that we're fans of the Mises Institute here. Jeff Deist was actually on the program about a month ago, and one of the things that he spoke about at a pretty good length in our episode was the Libertarian Party, the party of Harry Brown versus the party that we have today, and specifically talking about like your strategy that look. Like the liberty movement and just politics in general, like I'm so over that. Like if there's two things you wanted to do to really, really advance liberty, it's first of all, it's be successful libertarians. You got to be successful people and be libertarians, because nobody wants to hear what the neckbeard living in his mom's basement has to say about peace and war and drugs or whatever. You got to be a successful libertarian. So first of all, I want our people to be successful, happy people. I really do. And the second thing is that, but however, if you are going to be politically involved, if you are going to run candidates or whatever, for the love of God, man, find yourself another Harry Brown and a whole lot less Bill Welds.
Right. Well, and what exactly does that mean, right? Because they both wear nice suits.
Yeah.
What it means is Harry Brown had moral courage. And would never back down on anything. And what did he hate the most? He hated the worst things about the government the most, and he was determined to change them by any means within his power. Harry Brown, I don't know how many people know this, but Harry Brown wrote an essay on September 11th that was published the next day at WorldNet Daily and at antiwar.com called "When Will We Ever Learn?" It was about how you can't just go around the world killing people, killing women and children, and then expect that they're just going to let you get away with that forever. And just as Ron Paul said, if you ignore blowback, you ignore that at your own peril. And you let these people put us in greater danger by pretending that we can get away with this. Harry Brown wrote that on September the 12th. People threatened to kill him for that. And he said, you know what? Okay, maybe I should have waited a week. But still, no. I mean, that is absolutely right. And that's what you need to learn. That is the problem. And unless we face up to the unface up toolable, this is going to keep happening to us. And that is a guy who was as courageous as he was tall, right? And he was, as you say, he was a successful, classy guy, but he brought that never back downism with him too, and he set that example for what libertarians are supposed to be. And I think the only time I'd ever heard the word libertarian was I'd seen a bumper sticker that said "Enough is enough, vote libertarian," and I thought, oh, that's cool. Wow, so there's this thing where they really hate the Republicans and the Democrats equally, apparently, something like that. And then I saw Harry Brown in 1996 on C-SPAN, and I love this. It was in the third-party debates, but there was like 4 candidates in the third-party debates, because there's the Greens and the Constitution and the Natural Law Party and the Libertarians. And the one that I remember was they asked Harry Brown about abortion, and he said, well, I have my own personal opinions, but they're none of your business, because I'm only running for president, and the president of the United States of America has no authority over this question whatsoever. And, you people ought to read the Constitution. It's Article 2, and it expressly delineates what the authority of the president is, and abortion ain't in there. So I'm running because I want to limit the power of the presidency back to what the law says it's supposed to be in the first place. And I went, wow, I'd never heard a politician in my life say he was running to limit the power of his office. I guess Carol Keaton Rylander abolished an office here in Texas once. But anyway. And that was what impressed me, and that was when I started to learn more about libertarianism and more about this Harry Brown guy. And then, of course, up until his dying day, he died while in the middle of writing a book called The War Racket, taking on everything from Theodore Roosevelt up through the war on terrorism and to the current day, and how all of this ultimately amounts to a war against the American people on behalf of vested interests. Against the rest of us and this kind of thing. And that absolutely is the example that libertarians should follow, whether inside the party or out. And that's the same, Ron Paul put out a tweet yesterday that said, if you care about freedom, your first obligation is to support peace and to fight for peace. That is the father of all good things in life. That is it. That is the first principle. That's what makes Ron Paul, that's what made Harry Brown such heroes.
Yeah. Wow. Well, amen. I mean, if I don't know if you'll be able to talk Tom into it, but I'm on board with you 1,000% that if you can get a guy who is unapologetically, unabashedly libertarian, that's what you. I mean, no more intellectual lightweights. Like, look, I don't hate Gary Johnson. I don't dislike Larry Sharpe necessarily. But between you and me, I'm looking for a guy who is a long-term, deep-rooted libertarian who can answer all the questions. I mean, being able to clean up nice and speak eloquently is important if you want to be a politician. But it's not just about how you say it. But I'm talking deep little L libertarianism is what the next Libertarian Party candidate needs to be. But with that said, I want to transition here real quick. Sure. There's a word that's kind of been the buzzword for the last week or two, and that's traitor and treason. And we actually did an episode about a week or two ago, which was everything I don't like is treason. Yeah. So so you know where I'm going with this. We're going to do a little recap of the Helsinki summit with Trump and Putin. But I want to start off by saying this: was there anything from that week that you could possibly lay your finger on to say this is treasonous activity, or is Nazi now old and now we've moved on to treason because that's a new word?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, the most quotable use of that term that week was from John Brennan, Obama's second and last director of the CIA. Mm-hmm. Well, John Brennan's guilty of treason, for real. John Brennan and James Clapper, who was the DNI above him, they and Barack Obama, they are guilty of treason. They outright and quite deliberately supported al-Qaeda forces in Syria, beginning at the end of at least sometime in 2011, mm-hmm. and certainly into 2012. And they knew all along that all the jihadist forces there were led by what was known then as the Islamic State of Iraq, which was just the renamed Zarqawi's group from Iraq War II, al-Qaeda in Iraq. Mm-hmm. These are men. At that time, Baghdadi and his deputy Jolani, both sworn blood oath loyal to Ayman al-Zawahiri, the butcher of New York City. And in fact, there's a million evidences of this, but just a few weeks ago, Ben Rhodes, there was published an interview with Ben Rhodes, who was Obama's national security advisor, who calls it slightly absurd, treasonous. Mm-hmm. That they were supporting groups in Syria that were, as he put it, on the terrorist list. Yeah, on the terrorist list. Al-Qaeda in Iraq. Yeah. Sworn blood oath loyal to Ayman al-Zawahiri, the butcher of New York City. These men belong buried under the Supermax prison in Florence, Colorado. Full stop. Now, as far as Russia goes, we haven't been at war with Russia since Woodrow Wilson invaded Vladivostok in 1919. Yeah. That's it. So if you look at Aldrich Ames, you look at Robert Hansen, or any of the very worst of the American, spies who were recruited by the Soviet Union and or Russia to turn over American secrets to Russia, none of them were charged with treason because they weren't guilty of treason, because we weren't at war with Russia. Even during the height of the Cold War against Soviet communism, that wasn't a treason charge. Treason is specifically defined in the Constitution. It's the only crime specifically defined in the Constitution as waging war, taking up arms against this country, or providing direct aid and comfort to those who are doing so. That means in a time of war. Mm-hmm. And so if Donald Trump had gone over there and given Vladimir Putin a reach around and a nice back rub, and for that matter, the codes to our nuclear missiles, that still would not be treason. Mm-hmm. And, when John Brennan's talking like that, that's his guilty conscience. And I don't know why in the world Donald Trump doesn't order an investigation into everyone in the Obama administration who was behind backing al-Qaeda in Syria, which ended up leading to ISIS splitting off from al-Qaeda and going ahead and creating the Islamic State. The Islamo-fascist caliphate of George Bush and Osama bin Laden's wildest dreams literally became a reality because of these men for 3 years. They seized all of eastern Syria and all of western Iraq for 3 years as a direct consequence of John Brennan's treason there. So that's as far as that goes. Now, in terms of dealing with Russia, the fact of the matter is when we can get back in a minute to the so-called hacking of the election, which just means leaking Hillary's emails, right? They call that an attack, but that's not an attack. But, they always skip exactly what they're talking about. Russia attacked us, Russia attacked us, Russia attacked us. But what did they do? Did they sink one of our aircraft carriers? Did they attack Norfolk, Virginia? No, they didn't do anything except leak emails, supposedly. That's not an attack, okay? That's just BS to call that an attack. But regardless of that, the entire conflict between the United States and Russia is the United States' fault, period. It's Bill Clinton's fault, it's Barack Obama's fault, George W. Bush's fault, and Barack Obama's fault. When the Soviet Union was falling, between the fall of the Berlin Wall and the actual dissolution of the Soviet Union, but the liberation of the Eastern European states from the Warsaw Pact and all of that, James Baker III, George Bush Sr.'s Secretary of State, promised Gorbachev, we will not extend NATO 1 inch further to the east. And he meant even we won't put NATO bases in eastern Germany. If you let Germany reunite, if you pull your Soviet troops out of Germany, we won't even move NATO forces east within Germany. Well, they went ahead and did that. But then when Bill Clinton came into power, over the objection of George Kennan, the father of containment, of Paul Nitze, the father of rollback, of Robert McNamara, who was, the butcher of Korea and Vietnam in the name of containing communism. Over the objections of his own brilliant Secretary of Defense, William Perry, he expanded NATO to include Poland, and then worse, started moving into, I forget which all ones and which years, but started incorporating the Balkans and the Baltic states, and as Pat Buchanan says, further to the east, even than what we used to call Eastern Europe, all the way to Russia's literal doorstep. The Baltic states, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia are right there on Russia's border. And of course, Moscow is only, 300-400 miles to the east of that.
Yeah.
And George W. Bush expanded even further. Barack Obama expanded even further. And they threatened numerous times to even incorporate former Soviet Georgia and Ukraine into NATO. And not only that, but during the George W. Bush years, they launched, while everybody was distracted with Iraq and the media not paying attention, they launched these color-coded revolutions where they overthrew in coup d'etats, many times violent coup d'etats, in Georgia, the Rose Revolution, in Ukraine, the Orange Revolution, in Tajikistan, the Pink or Lemon Revolution, they called it. And there were a few more throughout Eastern Europe where anyone who was leaning pro-Russia, at least the CIA and the NED at least attempted to overthrow them, and in many cases succeeded in overthrowing them. Then, after Vladimir Putin saved Obama from his stupid red line threat, when al-Qaeda launched their false flag sarin attack in August of 2013, and Obama didn't really want to do it. He wanted to punt the thing to Congress. He did punt the thing to Congress. But then Putin came and said, I got an idea. What we'll do is we will oversee the destruction of all of Syria's chemical weapons if you don't invade. And they did. And they moved them, the Organization for the Prevention of Chemical, whatever the hell it's called, the UN organization there, they oversaw the transfer of all those chemical weapons to an American ship on the Mediterranean Sea, which destroyed all those chemical weapons. Well, partly as revenge for that, the neoconservatives inside the Obama government, namely Victoria Nuland, Robert Kagan's wife, who was the Deputy Secretary of Defense for European Affairs, helped to orchestrate a second coup d'etat in Ukraine, again against the very same elected leader, Yanukovych. And they overthrew him and they ran him out of power. Now, here's a very direct analogy. This isn't hyperbole, okay? What if the Russians overthrew the government of Canada twice in 10 years?
Yeah.
And what if the second time they did so, they used literal Hitler-loving Nazis to do it? And then what if the Quebecers said, you know what, we refuse to recognize the new coup d'etat junta. And then the new Russian-backed government sent Nazi militias to start murdering Frenchmen in Quebec. Or, French Canadians in Quebec.
Yeah.
America would go to nuclear war. America would kill every last Russian till they were all dead with hydrogen bombs. That's what would happen. That's what Ralph Nader would do if he was the president and Russia tried to pull that in Canada. Well, that's what America did to Ukraine, which is Russia Junior, right? It's their Canada. And that's what we did. And that's what the Obama government did, literally backing Hitler-loving Nazis, the proud grandsons of the men who served under Hitler in the Holocaust, not just in World War II, but helped to perpetrate the Holocaust against Jews and Poles and Roma and others in Ukraine during that time. Okay? And that's who Obama put in power there. And the Russians then, and in fact, they threatened specifically to kick the Russians out of their only warm water, all year round warm water port there on the Black Sea, Sevastopol on the Crimean Peninsula. And you can hear the Americans and their acolytes to this day screaming and crying that Russia seized Crimea. Well, they say seized because they can't say invaded, because one, they were already there leasing that base, and two, no one was killed. Not one person was killed. There were 2 shots fired, warning shots in the air over the heads of some Ukrainian soldiers who were told, you better skedaddle, and that was the end of that. Then they held a referendum, and the people of Crimea voted overwhelmingly to rejoin Russia. And it was German observers who came and verified the election was perfectly legit, etc. And now, the fact of the matter is, as the great David Stockman never ceases to point out, Ukraine never owned Crimea. Crimea belonged to Russia since 1783, when America was still under the Articles of Confederation. Before Ben Franklin and George Washington even did their coup and created the Constitution in our country, is when Catherine the Great bought it from Turkey. And they owned it all the way up until Khrushchev. After Stalin died, Khrushchev came to power, and drunk one night, and as a reward for the Ukrainian factions in the Communist Party helping him in his rise to power after Stalin, rewarded them by gifting them Ukraine. So now we're supposed to be, willing to risk war. Even Pompeo himself said, we will never recognize the Russian seizure of Crimea just a few weeks ago. Over what? Over the drunken word of the former commissar of the Soviet Politburo, of the Soviet Communist Party, the general secretary of the Soviet Union, made a decree in 1954. And now we're all supposed to be somehow bound by that? You're supposed to care at all that the people of Crimea wanted to be reabsorbed into Russia, and that the Russians, even after the coup, they didn't seize the peninsula until after, and this is in a British parliamentary report, until a letter was signed by 4 former Ukrainian presidents demanding that the Russians be kicked out of Sevastopol, and then also they passed a law banning Russian as a second language in the country, which was basically a declaration of war against the people of the East. And then when the people of the East said, well, we refuse to accept that, they launched a so-called war on terrorism and sent these Nazi militias to commit vast war crimes against them, killing thousands and thousands and thousands of people. And this is all Barack Obama's fault. This is all the USA's fault, from Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, and Barack Obama. And now all the worst things that Russia has done. If you say seizing Crimea was wrong, fine. But worse, their intervention in Syria, where they have killed, many thousands of civilians in their war in Syria. Well, what are they doing in Syria? Even in the words of John Kerry, secretly taped by Syrian rebels and the audio leaked, John Kerry admitted the only reason the Russians intervened was because the Islamic State was marching on Damascus. They had severed the last road, the last highway between Aleppo and Damascus, and they were threatening to take Damascus. And John Kerry says on tape, anybody can hear this, he says, listen, I'm sorry, you guys are asking for more weapons? Man, we gave you plenty of guns. We've given you so many guns. Syria is lousy with guns right now, and that includes TOW anti-tank missiles and the rest of this. He says, and this helped lead to the rise of the Islamic State. But we thought we could manage. Mm-hmm. We thought that this would force Assad to negotiate his own surrender of power, that he would step down. But that's not what happened. Instead, he called Vladimir Putin and asked for help. And Vladimir Putin said, yes, fine, I will help save Damascus. And Putin then sent in the Russian Air Force to bomb, again, John Brennan's CIA-backed al-Qaeda terrorists. And the Islamic State had broken off from them, but really not quite. In fact, you could say Syria and al-Qaeda, the al-Nusra Front, had broken off from the Islamic State. So the Islamic State was al-Qaeda in Iraq. They had renamed themselves that in 2006. And it was only in 2013 that Baghdadi decided to stop obeying Zawahiri, and the al-Nusra Front decided to stay with Zawahiri and al-Qaeda. But in either case, the Americans declared war against ISIS almost immediately in the summer of 2014 and went to war against them. And so all of the very worst accusations that you can make against Vladimir Putin are only, and I'm not saying they're wrong, because he absolutely has committed war crimes in Syria, in massive bombardments of civilian populations and so forth, but only in reaction to America's aggressive foreign policies.
Now, one thing I want to touch on, kind of like tying all this together about libertarians being anti-war, is you probably remember this in the news because look, we're definitely no Trump fans here, but we bash Trump all the time. But one thing that I'll never forget as far as recent history goes is when Trump was dropping the Moabs in Afghanistan, the mother of all bomb, he was being cheered by left-wing politicians and left-wing media as well as right-wing politicians and right-wing media. And then vice versa, when he's going to a summit with another world leader. I mean, obviously this is Putin in Russia, and I know that there's backstory there, but I mean, trade that name with anybody. I don't care who it is. And of course, obviously talking to Kim in North Korea is that is, no matter what comes of that is some alternative to war. Any type of conversation is an alternative to war. And yet, surprise, surprise, left-wing media and left-wing politicians are criticizing that, and right-wing media and right-wing politicians are criticizing that. So what kind of effed up world, I'm trying to keep my language clean, what kind of effed up world do we live in when both left and right-wing politicians and corporate media cheer you for dropping a bomb in the middle of nowhere, but condemn you for speaking to a world leader, regardless of what country of origin?
Yeah. Well, okay, so one small point of fact there, first of all, is the Moab bomb was dropped in Nangarhar province in eastern Afghanistan on Islamic State fighters there, so-called Islamic State fighters. They're really just local Pashtun resistance. But I think you're referring to the cruise missile strikes on Bashar al-Assad in April of 2017 and again in April of 2018, both over false flag chemical weapons attacks perpetrated by the jihadists there. But anyway, just to be clear on that point. But yes, you're absolutely right. And, I mean, just think of the unreality where since 2011, al-Qaeda in Iraq, Zarqawi's guys from Iraq War II, have been the moderate rebels that we support in their heroic resistance fight against the evil Bashar al-Assad.
Yeah.
Right? And why? And Obama explained this to Jeffrey Goldberg in The Atlantic in 2012. The headline is, "As President, I Don't Bluff." I'm talking about Iran there. And Jeffrey Goldberg says to Obama, hey, man, it seems to me like if we were to get rid of Bashar al-Assad, that would help take Iran down a peg in the region, since Assad is Iran's last ally. And Obama says, that's right, Jeffrey Goldberg, and that's what we're doing. And Goldberg says, well, what more can be done to help this? And Obama says, well, your security clearance isn't high enough, so I can't tell you. Right? And in other words, I tell you, but I'd have to kill you kind of thing, because at that point, he was already guilty of high treason. Okay? Iran, Assad, the Ayatollah, Assad, Nasrallah of Hezbollah, they didn't knock our towers down. They weren't the guys that killed 4,000 of the American soldiers in Iraq War II. That was al-Qaeda and, well, the Sunni-based insurgency in Iraq that al-Qaeda was an integral part of during Iraq War II. But our government prefers our enemies, which, of course, they made these enemies for us in the first place. But al-Qaeda actually has shed innocent civilian American blood, as well as the blood of our soldiers in Iraq War II. And our government prefers them to Iran and its friends, because Iran stands in the way of our government's imperial hegemony in their part of the world, on the other side of the planet from here, where it's of no interest to you or me whatsoever. And they're happy to admit it. And then the whole time, back to your cheering media chorus here, the whole time, Fox News, MSNBC, CNN, the New York Times, the Washington Post, the LA Times, everybody knows Al-Qaeda are the good guys in Syria because they're up against Assad, and Assad is friends with Iran, and that's what Israel wants. And that's Israel's priority, and so that must be. And why was Obama saying this to Jeffrey Goldberg? Because Jeffrey Goldberg is Israel's enforcer in the American media. Step out of line, he calls you an anti-Semite and destroys your career. And the entire purpose of that interview, actually, even the headline, as I said, I don't bluff. As president, I don't bluff. What's he saying? He's saying to Jeffrey Goldberg, please, Mr. Israeli Ombudsman, tell Netanyahu and his government that I swear to God, I will not let Iran get nukes. If I have to start a war against them to prevent them from getting nukes, I will. But trust me, I really am just trying to negotiate them away from the ability to make nukes, okay? That was the whole point of that interview, was how can I appease Israel by Barack Obama? And that was the entire context of this. And so then, of course, there's all the money and the generals and the military-industrial complex and all the vested interests in provoking conflict. And, you know, you mentioned Korea there. When Donald Trump went to Korea, the CSIS, the Center for Science and International Security, I think it's called, they immediately put out this tweet that said, if Trump negotiates a peace deal in Korea, well, that would jeopardize our reason for staying in Korea. They don't even know how horrible that sounds.
Yeah.
And in fact, they admitted, there were other sources that admitted right away, well, listen, we have our 30,000 guys in Korea, but they're not really there for North Korea. They're there to help him in China. But if we don't have the North Korean threat excuse to keep them in South Korea, we might have to withdraw them from South Korea. And that would limit our threat against China. But look at what was the previous history here just in the last year. Trump was threatening fire and fury that the world has never seen before. Kim Jong-un was testing intercontinental ballistic missiles that can reach the United States. And I don't think he successfully miniaturized nukes in order to marry them to those missiles yet. But that was the threat. And already has the ability to nuke Tokyo, to nuke Seoul. And these people would prefer a real threat of nuclear war, nuclear brinksmanship, completely unnecessarily, just as the excuse to keep troops there for their own self-licking ice cream cone reasons and for the reasons of threatening China. I mean, and they don't know that they sound like absolutely insane psychopaths straight out of Dr. Strangelove here. They think that this is the status quo, this is what makes sense, and how dare Donald Trump and Mike Pompeo think that they can try to make a deal with Korea. And, you know, by the way, look at who Pompeo is. He's not just some conventional Jeb Bush Republican. He's a far right-wing kook, born-again nut from Kansas, who's allied with Frank Gaffney and the worst of the neoconservatives. And he, as CIA director, went over to Korea and started laying the groundwork for these talks. And he must have, we can see, there's no doubt. He came back to D.C. and he told Donald Trump, we can do this. They're ready to deal. We can make a deal to denuclearize the peninsula, to call off this crisis once and for all. Now, that means that it's true, right? If Pompeo is satisfied that a deal can be reached here in the first place to even tell Trump that this is worth pursuing, then that means it's worth pursuing. Full stop. That's it. Now, any reasonable human on this planet should prefer that. And instead, what do we get? Oh, Donald Trump, he's such a sucker. He's such a fool. He's such an idiot. Oh, Kim Jong-un is just bending him over a barrel. Kim Jong-un is never going to disarm. Kim Jong-un is never going to deal in good faith. You know how those North Koreans are with their tricky trickster ways and all this, and they'll never let up. And then, you know, meanwhile, they destroy a nuclear missile test facility. They start repatriating the corpses of American soldiers killed in the Korean War. They're negotiating with the South Korean government on a final peace agreement. They have their generals meeting with the South Korean generals to just ratchet down tensions on the DMZ overall. The whole process is being led by Moon Jae-in, the president of South Korea. And everyone in the world says this is wonderful, including Moon, who thanked Donald Trump basically for letting him do this and letting him pursue this. The only people in the world who are opposed are in Washington, D.C. and New York City.
Yeah.
It's disgusting.
Well, I know Michael Malice, he tweets probably at least once a day on Twitter, an example exactly like you just gave with the tagline, "The corporate media is the enemy of the American people," full stop.
Absolutely correct.
So we're running short on time. I want to make sure to get to one more thing before we let you go. I wanted to get a little bit of your thoughts on the humanitarian crisis in Yemen, and that's putting it nicely. And the reason why I wanted to talk about that before we went today is that this whole conversation is sort of a microcosm to my point about Yemen, is that it's so easily forgotten, isn't it? Like it's easily forgotten intentionally, because if you're an average American reading the newspaper and watching TV, you don't even know Yemen exists. It's very likely you've heard anything. I'd actually had an article. I'm going to pull it up real quick before I let you talk about this. It was from thehill.com. I think it was just earlier today or yesterday. They had Catherine Zimmerman on the show there, where they were talking about the humanitarian crisis in Yemen. She was saying, yes, it's for sure one of the biggest ones. Talking about 20 million people that before the wars there was already 20 million people at risk of famine and starvation. But of course, obviously now it's way worse. But even then, even so, there's nothing in this article really talking about how the situation became what it is. I mean, basically all they have in the whole article is conflict began in 2014, Iranian-backed Houthis took over the capital city, and then a Saudi-led coalition along with the Yemeni government is waging war against the rebels. That's it. That's all the article says. So help us out, Scott.
Well, and every bit of that is just a damn lie. That's just not right. So first of all, what are the other humanitarian crises on the planet right now in second, third, fourth, and fifth place? Mm-hmm. Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Libya, Mali, America's wars.
Yeah.
Congo as well. Mm-hmm. And which that's the one I'm the worst on, but I've got a couple interviews on it if people are interested in that. Millions killed in the Congo in the Bush-Obama years. Okay, so everything that she just said about what was going on there is just wrong. I mean, to reduce the Houthis to the Iranian-backed Houthis makes it sound like this is an Iranian project at all, which it's not.
Yeah.
There are no Iranians on the ground in Yemen fighting this war, and that is not the reason. In fact, the Iranians warned the Houthis, do not take the capital city of Sana'a at the end of 2014, because they said this will provoke a Saudi war and you don't want that. And the Houthis ignored the Iranians' advice and did it anyway. Mm-hmm. But anyway, so wait, let me rewind more. Obama comes into power in 2009, and immediately he steps up the drone war. And Bush had already been killing people with drones there on a very limited basis. I think the first one was in 2004. He even killed an American citizen in that one, although I think he just happened to be there with some other guys. Was not the target himself. But anyway, Obama comes in and he tells the CIA, go after al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, big time. He takes the gloves off. In fact, when he announced his Afghan escalation at the end of November 2009, at the very end of that speech, he said, Yemen, Somalia, you're next, look out. Well, he'd already been bombing Yemen. He'd started the campaign in the beginning of that month. And it was only after about 4 weeks of that that you might remember the underpants bomber had his failed attack over Detroit on Christmas Day. And then later it turned out Patrick Kennedy from the State Department admitted that they knew he was working with al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, and they let him on the plane anyway because they wanted to follow him and see who he talked to in the U.S. Didn't realize he had a bomb in his pants. He almost caused a major catastrophe over an American city on Christmas Day that year. But anyway, so Obama, starting in the fall of 2009, started this massive drone campaign and including massive killings of civilians, including killing tribal leaders who were actually at the vanguard of the fight against al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula there at the time, which was a very small group. And of course, the more Obama bombed them, the more and more powerful that they got. And in order to bomb them, he was bribing Saleh, who the American government had been backing since at least the Reagan years, the dictator of Yemen there. And or I should say at least the Bush senior years, but I think the Reagan years. But so Obama started bribing Saleh with money and guns to let him attack al-Qaeda. Well, Saleh was playing a double game and was backing al-Qaeda and their friends because he was using them to attack the Houthis in the north. The Houthis, that's a political designation. It's a political faction in the north made up of Zaidi Shia. And so what happened was he attacked the Houthis over and over again, 4 or 5 times, and every time they beat him and pushed his forces back. And just like with Obama's war against al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula in the south of the country, the more he bombed them and attacked them, the more and more powerful they got in response. Okay? Well, then the Arab Spring came in 2011. And virtually all factions in Yemen descended on the town square there in Sana'a to demand Saleh's ouster. And then there was an attempted assassination, I think 2 bombings, one of which wounded him severely. And so he had to go and recuperate. The dictator Saleh had to go and recuperate. And then Hillary Clinton did this rigged election, which literally you can find it on Google. Just put in Saleh election in your Google images and you'll see pictures of the ballot. There's one name and one picture, one man on the ballot. And Hillary Clinton, claimed that this so-called election of Mansour Abdul Hadi was, bringing democracy to Yemen. And the problem is Hadi had no popular support whatsoever. He wasn't actually elected at all. And he had no popular support from any faction at all. And so, and then the former dictator Saleh quit, but he didn't just quit. He took his army with him. Yeah. They stayed loyal to him. And guess what? He went and made an alliance with the Houthis because even though he wasn't a Houthi, he actually was a Zaidi Shia. And so had enough of a basis to make an alliance with them. So after a couple of more years of war, at the end of 2014, in the beginning of 2015, the Houthis plus Saleh and his armed forces marched on Sana'a, the capital, and forced Hadi to flee, again, over the direct wishes of the Iranians who were advising them not to do so. And at that point, you also had now the crown prince, then the deputy crown prince of Saudi Arabia, MBS, they call him, Mohammed bin Salman. He had just been named deputy crown prince and defense minister. So he had domestic, political, public choice theory type reasons to launch a war. He was only 29 years old at the time. And so this was a way for him to solidify his power by launching this very short and successful war. It was to be Operation Decisive Storm. And that's the war that's now lasted for 3.5 years. Yeah. And that's the war that is backed by the United Arab Emirates and by the United States. The blockade is enforced by the U.S. Navy. If that doesn't sound like 100% American ownership of the war right there already, then I don't know what to tell you. But not only that, you have American contractors, military men, and CIA spies helping to designate the targets, collecting all the intelligence, helping run the war out of Saudi Arabia. Obama and Trump continue to sell the Saudis bombs and planes and everything they need. Our planes provide the aerial refueling for the Saudi pilots. And I don't know if you count this as confirmed. I have 3 different sources who each have one source. So if they had 2 sources each, that'd be good enough. But I got 3 sources with 1 source each. You can call it hearsay if you want, that say that there are even white boy Americans sitting in the back seat of these Saudi F-15s, holding the Saudi princelings' little hands all the way to their civilian targets, bombing funerals, bombing marketplaces, bombing the waterworks and the electricity. Amnesty just came out last week complaining that they have again bombed the waterworks facilities in the north of the country. Bombing the ports where they import their emergency relief supplies over and over again, committing massive war crimes against the civilian population of the country there. And they've achieved absolutely nothing for it. Well, I shouldn't say absolutely nothing. They've taken control. The UAE forces on the ground control the south. What they call the south is basically the south and east of the country, while the Houthis still control Sana'a, the Hodeidah port on the Red Sea, and then all the way up north to the Saudi border. And when they say humanitarian crisis, to get to your question about the suffering of the civilians here, due to previous, you won't be surprised by this, Alan, due to previous IMF and World Bank gangsterism, the Yemenis had been bribed basically out of growing their traditional crops like sorghum that they use to feed themselves, and instead to grow more coffee to sell on the international market. Well, that's fine until we put you under blockade. And now that you're cut off from the global economy and you cannot trade, you can't eat coffee either. And so the society at the time of the launch of the war was 80 to 90% dependent on foreign food imports. And now that has been cut off. And so throughout the time of the war, you've had Red Cross, Red Crescent, Oxfam, and whatever other relief organizations have been allowed most of the time to provide relief supplies at the port of Hodeidah. But then the Saudis came and bombed all the cranes and destroyed the port for a while there. Then the UN came and sponsored an effort to rebuild and install new cranes there. But the port of Hodeidah is right now under attack by UAE forces. You won't be surprised to find out that 3 months ago when they launched the attack, they said this will be Operation Decisive Seize the Port Town, and that they're still bogged down south of Hodeidah in bitter fighting against the Houthis. Nasser Arabi, a reporter I often talk to, in fact, I just spoke to him again this morning. He's a reporter from Sana'a that used to report for the New York Times. They were interested in what he had to say back during the war just against AQAP, but they don't want to hear from him now. But he talked about how the people of the town of Hodeidah have a very limited ability to flee. There's nowhere to go. And the terrain around there is very rough. It's basically very difficult. They're basically trapped there, the civilian population, as this battle continues. And then as the war is going on, trade is just completely shut off. Now, last year, you may have heard that as many as 1 million people were infected with cholera. Yes. That is, in fact, overblown. I've talked on the phone on my show with various representatives from Doctors Without Borders, Oxfam, and all different journalists, and United Nations, humanitarian relief people, and all of this kind of thing. And basically, they said anybody with diarrhea, they're counting as cholera because they really don't have a way to test for it. But it was still, at the very minimum, tens of thousands of people infected with cholera. And a big part of that, too, was because they moved the central bank down to Aden. And so all the civil servants up in the north of the country stopped getting their salaries. So all of the, all the garbage men, basically all the sanitation workers were fired and laid off. And so that whole system broke down. And so the water's polluted. And to be perfectly frank about this, what this means, these children who are dying of cholera, they are vomiting and diarrheaing themselves to death. Mm-hmm. That is what the United States of America is doing to these babies. And the United Nations just came out with a report a few weeks ago saying that they estimate 50,000 children have died of deprivation in this war in the last 3 years. And then on top of that, another probably 50 to 70,000 killed in airstrikes and other actual, violent action on the ground there. And it is absolutely just the lowest pit of hell. And it's all because of Barack Obama and because of Donald Trump. And as long as I'm mentioning that, so this goes to what you're saying about how nobody cares. And that's why. It's because it's a bipartisan war. If the whole thing could be blamed on Obama, then the Republicans would attack him for it. The whole thing could be blamed on Trump. The Democrats would use it as a talking point. But since it's both of them, then it's in nobody's interest, nobody who has any power or influence, or no one in the media's interest, to make a big deal about this, because then they have to be a hypocrite or they have to indict their guy. And so instead they just keep their mouths shut. And I should say, though, that Senator Mike Lee and Senator Bernie Sanders and some others in the House of Representatives also have heroically tried to pass resolutions to stop this war, although they failed both times in the House and in the Senate with their various efforts. But Chris Murphy is one who, and I know he's bad on a lot of things, but he's really tried as hard as he can to stop this thing. And it's completely out of control. And then the good news is, though, that the United Nations Security Council is meeting tomorrow, and their guy Martin Griffiths, who is the new United Nations special reporter and whatever his title is to brief them on the current situation. And I think with, as Nasser Arabi was saying on my show today, that the Houthis have gotten missile strikes off at the Aramco facilities in Saudi. They hit an airport in Abu Dhabi. They hit a Saudi oil tanker in the Red Sea recently. And so they're getting the attention more and more of the these factions, the Saudis and the UAE, that they just can't win this thing. And so possibly there will be an incentive on them to go ahead and come to a negotiated settlement. Because the fact of the matter is, the Hadi government is not the legitimate government. As that clip you read, it right there says, it's the Saudis, the UAE, and the Yemeni government are trying to take back over the country. Yeah, the Yemeni government, Hadi, hiding in a hotel room in Riyadh. Yeah. Right? That's not the legitimate government at all. A one-man election held by Hillary Clinton does not a legitimate government make in any sense, even if you believe in the myth of popular sovereignty in any sense. The Houthis are the government of Yemen now, and whether they like it or whether they don't. And damn, there was one more major point I was going to make about this, but I can't remember. I'm sorry.
No, that's all right. But if there's any takeaway from this episode at all, it's what we've already discussed, which is if there's any room in the political sphere for libertarians, it has to be on a foundation of being anti-war. All of this is just, absolute nonsense. Everyone will remember, the Madeleine Albright, 500,000 dead kids is worth it. Right. The crisis in Yemen right now, the corporate media cheering on war. I have to believe, I guess just to make myself feel better, I don't know, but I have to believe that I don't know how to put this into words. I've often heard the analogy that, during Vietnam, it was so much easier to have a powerful anti-war movement because you saw the imagery on nightly news. You saw the burnt corpses and just piles of bodies, and it was horrific and it was terrible. But that's what war is. It's horrific and terrible. There's, you're talking about MBS touting a military campaign that was going to be quick and decisive. Boy, he would fit right in Washington, D.C., wouldn't he? Yeah. Quick and decisive. But that's I feel like if there's it's a terrible thing to say, but if there's a service that people like Scott Horton, yourself, can provide, it's talking about these subjects and showing people the horrificness of the things that are happening in places like Somalia, Yemen, the Congo, for no other reason than I feel like the average American public today, when they think of war, they think of the night vision camera, the little lights flying through the air, hitting anti-air installations, and they think that's war. It's just crumbling brick. It's a couple of weeks of tanks rolling down the street, and then you hang a new banner, and all the red silk comes down, the blue silk goes up, and the war is over. And that's what they actually think war is in the 21st century, which is insane. I mean, obviously we know this, but it's one of those things where I think the average person knows that all of these terrible things happen. But there's
well, you know what it is too, is even critics will say it's the drone strikes, Obama's drone wars. And as horrible as they are, I mean, the drone wars, you look at what the damage they've done in Afghanistan, Pakistan, Yemen, Somalia with these drones. They kill innocent people all the time. And yet it does sound, doesn't it? Like, well, it's one 500-pound bomb at a time. It's not like carpet bombing over North Vietnam from B-52s, right? It's much less than that. It's a surgical strike. It's a scalpel instead of George Bush. In fact, there's a great debate between Jeremy Scahill and Bill Maher, where Scahill is saying, look, they're killing people. And Bill Maher goes, yeah, but George Bush marched the 3rd Infantry Division into Iraq, which means then that any killing less than a full-scale invasion of Iraq has got to be somehow permissible. But in fact, the drone wars themselves are absolutely horrible, but it isn't just the drone wars, right? You look at Libya and Syria, again, where America took the side of the jihadists. The drones are nothing compared to American air cover and CIA support, tow missiles, and all of this. Billions of dollars, $1 billion a year the CIA spent in Syria for 5 years straight helping these jihadis suicide bomb people to death. That's war now, is, white officers and spies with local brown auxiliaries carrying out their atrocities for them. And it still matters just as much, just to go back to your point that, you should still care about this, even if it's less than what Johnson and Nixon did in Nam, even if it's less than what Bush Jr. did marching into Iraq. It's still an absolute horror show over there.
Well, I'll always remember, it was a comment that Ron Paul had made once. I believe he made it on the House floor, where he had said, people have been programmed to think that the technology is so great that when we shoot a cruise missile into, the bad guys, whatever that means, that there's this magical little pieces of shrapnel that just only it's like homing beacons. It just goes straight to all the enemy combatants and soldiers. But that's ridiculous. That's not how bombs work. The technology ain't that great, kids. It hits women, it hits children, it hits schools, it hits hospitals. Of course, I mean, we could certainly make an argument that they do some of those things intentionally. But even if you believe that they never intentionally do anything like that, that's just not the case. And so again, I mean, we've got to harp on it that I've said it on this program before. I'll say it again. I don't really like getting into this whole who is and isn't a real libertarian stuff, because you can go down that rabbit hole a long way. I mean, I'm an anarchist, but if I'm willing to work with anybody if they can advance the cause of liberty an inch. But with that said, for anybody that's sitting at home watching this, watching your program, whatever, do not call yourself a libertarian if you're not anti-war.
Right. That's
here.
Key.
All right. Well, Scott, thank you so much.
Thank you, Scott.
People, go to scotthorton.org. That's where you can find more information of Scott, his articles, The Scott Horton Show, which is up to a bajillion episodes now, libertarianinstitute.org, and antiwar.com. Is there anything else, Scott?
My book, Fool's Errand, Time to End the War in Afghanistan. As you said, now available in audiobook, too, if you think you could stand to listen to 9 hours of this.
Well, I've done that. I've stood to listen to it. I've got it pulled up right here. You can find that on Amazon, Kindle, paperback, and audiobook. Blake, you got anything for us, or your head's about to explode?
No, just real quick. I mean, as growing up as a conservative, in this country my whole life, I've always thought that everything that America did was right and was justified, and that we were the good guys and we were the ones that were making the difference in the world, and everything that we did was somehow, I don't know, blessed, and what we did was right. What we did was always the right thing. And I mean, you almost start to lose heart in who you are, because I mean, our country is behind a lot of its own problems, a lot of the world's struggles.
Yeah.
It's hard for me because I'm always confused about it. What does it mean to be an American now? Well,
that's because I don't want to go down that rabbit hole.
No, that's a rabbit hole for another time.
But I just want to say to your comment is that it's that for people like you who are questioning themselves, how did we get here and where do I fit in? It's understanding that when you say we we and the state are two different people.
Yeah.
We are not the state. I am not the state. They don't. I mean,
I get that now.
They sure as hell weren't asking my permission, but
Yeah.
they're not doing this with my blessing.
They're definitely not doing it for our blessing.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean,
so Scott, I can't thank you enough for
Scott.
coming on the show, man. It's always great. I mean, we could have shows every single week with you, and we still wouldn't even scratch the surface of this stuff. But I can't thank you enough for being on the show again.
Thank you guys both very much. I really appreciate you having me.
We appreciate it.
All right.
Man.
Are you good?
That's it, man.
All right, buddy. We'll see you next week.